Title of my talk is called Coach Killers or Creditors, Player Salaries as Debt. What I really want to do today is try to reevaluate the player-team management relationship through the context of the team's financial structure. What I really most of all want to say is that we're trying to apply a more rigorous framework to understand why certain players have and arguably should have the influence that they do. It's not so much that they're immune from criticism, it's just more a matter of that it's appropriate for them to have the authority or influence. It's more a matter of evaluating how they choose to utilize that influence. The example on screen is obviously Alex Ovechkin, who's obviously near and dear to my heart because I live in Washington, D.C., although I am a Rangers fan. Thank you, Craig, 94. Get tears. No, but Ovechkin's a good example. He was born out of the sort of failed years with Jaromir Jagr in the early aughts, where interest in the Capitals sort of took a turn for the worse for a while, and then he was the number one pick in 2004. He was wildly successful on an individual and team level for his first 3 years, and he ended up signing a 13-year, $124 million contract in 2008. And the team still owes him around $79 million through 2021, subject to escrow and all the wonderful machinations of the NHL CBA. I'd argue he's the single largest asset, even still, after some disappointment in recent years that the Capitals have, and yet he doesn't show up on the balance sheet. I'd argue that, at least metaphorically, he should. So why are player salaries like debt? Or in what ways are they analogous? They're payments that share three major characteristics, very similar to the major characteristics of debt. They're pre-tax payments, or pre-tax expenses. They're fixed payments in amount and duration. And if you fail to pay a player's salary, you obviously end up running the risk of losing control of the player as an asset and also losing control of potentially the team through bankruptcy. We see this all the time in financial accounting, where we make judgments for valuation purposes that differ from existing accounting and tax standards. And some of these actually implicitly acknowledge the sort of treatment I'm talking about. Now, the most common example of off-balance sheet financing are operating and capitalized leases, leases, and the decision on whether to capitalize a lease on your books for a retail store chain or a restaurant chain. Vast majority of locations typically are, or not, maybe not the vast majority, but the majority of locations are typically leased and not outright owned. Typically, when you would be evaluating these firms to properly account for the risk that they have, you'd be sort of analogizing those leases as if they were borrowing the money to purchase the underlying storefront or restaurant space or what have you. And that gives you a much better idea of the true leverage of the firm, the true debt-to-capital ratios, et cetera. Given that some of the technical elements for operating versus capital leases are sort of not really that interesting for the purposes of our conversation here, but one of the major ones is obviously that it takes the bulk of the useful life of the asset. And certainly with the case of these sort of high-dollar guaranteed contracts, which is bulk of what we're talking about right now, most of the time it is talking about things that are players where you're using the bulk of their useful life, or at least a substantial portion of it. So just sort of to give the broad context of what we're working with. Now, obviously the biggest thing is that players you can't really own a person, right? The Civil War sort of settled that. But the IRS actually disagrees with us. The IRS treatment for purchases of sports teams since the man pictured here, Bill Veeck, purchased the Cleveland Indians in 1946, has allowed for the depreciation of player contracts. In other words, the capitalization of players on the balance sheet for tax purposes. It's been codified by Congress in 1976, and as recently as 2004 was changed from a 5-year 50% depreciation to now you can depreciate or amortize all intangible assets over a 15-year period. If you look through the intangible assets a team possesses over that time period, if you look at the financial statements that were leaked to Deadspin for both MLB teams and NBA teams over the last few years, you can really sort of get a good estimate of how much this is worth, and it clearly could be worth up to tens of millions of dollars for some of these teams. Now, there's other treatments of this within the existing accounting standards that are sort of acknowledged as sort of capitalization policy for players. Transfer payments in soccer, cash included in trades, signing bonuses. These are all typically capitalized on the balance sheet. For example, Shea Weber, who signed an offer sheet with the Philadelphia Flyers that was ultimately matched by the Nashville Predators, the signing bonuses accounted for $68 million over the period of 5 years. I'd argue whatever the present value of $68 million is would roughly, if sort of accidentally, capture Shea Weber's value to that franchise. More than that, the most famous example is obviously deferred compensation. The man pictured behind me, Mario Lemieux, ended up converting $30 million of deferred compensation into equity and led the Pittsburgh Penguins out of bankruptcy, ended up obviously being a player and then owner, and then now owns the team along with Ron Burkle now. And typically you'll see other players like A-Rod was the largest unsecured creditor of the Texas Rangers when they declared bankruptcy, and Manny Ramirez more recently with the Los Angeles Dodgers in 2011. Given that we are in Boston, I'd just like to take a moment to contemplate Manny Ramirez converting that debt into equity and owning the Dodgers for a moment. All right, so why does this matter? Well, a lot of leverage is hidden on this balance sheet. So league posturing is going to reflect this as well. If you look at the 2002 attempt by Bud Selig to enforce what he called the debt service rule, the 60-40 rule, which was a ratio of 60% or 60% assets to 40% liabilities. He actively tried to seek to have future player contracts included as debt at that particular point in time. And as recently as 2006 and 2007, USA Today would come out with an annual point every year to show how large the future contracts owed to players were. If we took the 2012 opening day estimates of Forbes of the debt carried by the 30 Major League Baseball teams, it was around $5.1 billion. If you included all of the future player contracts discounted around 5%, which again, thanks to the Great Leagues to Deadspin, we knew was roughly the credit facility rate for Major League Baseball as a whole, we're looking at around another $4.5 billion. So in other words, we're talking, or $4.6 billion actually. So what we're talking is roughly double the amount of debt the teams have is hidden there. It's not to say that they can't carry that debt and carry it well, but it's a matter of understanding the risk involved with the capital structure of these teams. And more recently, in both NBA and NHL lockouts, term limits on player contracts were a very big source of contention, and there were some reports and analysis that said that that was because it was harder to sell teams if you had large, long-term guaranteed contracts attached to it. The Deputy Commissioner of the NHL, Bill Daley, said that a 5-year term limit on contracts in December was the hill, quote, the hill we will die on. 2 weeks later, they upped it to 7 years, 8 if it was your own player. But the point is that they were very concerned about having the length of these large, long-term contracts. Now, as far as the player-team dynamic goes, you have a situation where if we're agreeing that future player salaries, or at least you're buying into it for the sake of the discussion today, are roughly analogous to debt, does that make players de facto providers of capital as well as labor? And what are the implications of this? If they're essentially creditors as well as employees, and they're playing that dual role, it's sort of an interesting analogy, right? Because creditors are always mostly worried about collecting their return on investment, their interest in their principal, and that's what they're interested in protecting. In the case of athletes, there's very little risk of their contract not being paid. It's very hard to get rid of a player's contract other than the buyout mechanisms within the collective bargaining agreement. Even those are fairly stringent. More than that, the leagues typically, I don't think there's much risk of a team going so bankrupt that they end up having to retract in the middle of a season. Now, for star players who likely can get equivalent financial offers from multiple different sources, multiple different teams, I should say, a lot of that return may be more intangible. It might be in terms of playing time or playing style, particular ideas. I sort of analogize these to covenants. I call them implicit covenants. Typically, when you borrow money through a normal debt arrangement, whether it's a credit facility or a bond issue or what have you, there'll be contractual limits put on those debts called covenants. Now, you can't get a contract. I mean, Carmelo Anthony, when he got traded to the Knicks and re-signed, he can't get a contract that guarantees an isolation-heavy offense with 25 shots a game, but I also think that there was a very clear mutual understanding that what Carmelo's role in the team would be. And so when that clashed naturally with Mike D'Antoni's preferred playing style, it's no surprise that the Knicks thought that the asset value in Carmelo moving forward would generate more revenue than D'Antoni, and he ended up winning that argument. Now, back to Ovechkin, which is, I think, a very good case study and one that I've seen play out during my professional career down there and just as a fan. So Ovechkin signs the 13-year, $124 million contract in January of 2008. It's essentially the bulk of his useful life of his career in the NHL. Now, how much is that worth to the Capitals? We can say that Forbes estimated the Capitals in the fall of 2007 to be worth around $145 million. Luckily, Ted Leonsis, the owner of the Capitals, pictured here as well with Ovechkin on the day he signed the contract, gave an interview in the spring of 2008 that said the Forbes numbers were a bleeping joke and that his bankers had estimated the team was worth around $225 to $250 million. Now, obviously, this doesn't include the future value of player contracts because that's not standard practice. So we know that the Caps are worth somewhere between $145 and $250 million. It's worth noting as an aside that Leonsis gave a interview the next year where he said that there was no debt at the team level, but I'm going to use Forbes' numbers because it's the best estimate we have, and every financial structure can be different for accounting standards. Now, so Forbes estimated a 47% debt to capital ratio. That means Ted and his partners have 53% of the equity, and debt holders, however defined, had around 47% of the equity, or the debt in the ratio. If you use a 10% discount rate on the day Ovechkin signed his contract, roughly twice as risky as baseball, his contract was worth around $67 million in present value in the spring of 2008. Now, if we look at this and capitalize Ovechkin's contract as debt and divide up the pie a little bit differently, according to Ted's banker's view, which is obviously the $250 million valuation, Ovechkin controls around a fifth of the capital, represents around a fifth of the capital of the Capitals at the time. If you go to the Forbes' view, which is $150 million plus the $67 million for Ovechkin, you're talking he occupies around a third of the capital structure. Now, how did it work out? For a while there, it worked out great. 4 straight division titles under Coach Bruce Boudreau, pictured in the back with his hands in the air. A couple MVPs and a ton of scoring titles for Ovechkin, tons of awards, very big excitement. A solid streak that began in 2009 and has continued as of their most recent home game. But they didn't get to the Eastern Conference Finals. And entering in the fall of last year, on November 1st, Boudreau was already in a situation where he was trying to emphasize a more, what he called accountable style, where his defensive emphasis, he moved Ovechkin out of his favorite position on the power play. He cut his playing time from over 20 minutes a game to under it. And in general, their relationship started to fray. In a critical situation on the November 1st game against Anaheim, in an empty net situation where the team was trailing, Ovechkin was left on the bench. Ovechkin called him an expletive on national TV. By the end of the month, the Capitals still in a lot of trouble. Boudreau was gone. Enter Dale Hunter, Capitals legend, and in Hunter's introductory press conference, George McPhee, the general manager of the Capitals, was asked, could Ovechkin's captaincy be stripped? And GM just simply said, that's just not going to happen. Now, Hunter does, however, decide to have a much more defensive style and hold much more, he emphasized accountability far more than his predecessor had, cuts Ovechkin's playing time even more to the point where third liners and fourth liners occasionally played more than him even in the playoffs. And they ended up coming within a game of the Eastern Conference Finals. Now, after the season when Hunter resigned and returned to London, Ontario, where he owned his minor league team, Ovechkin did not really show a ton of remorse for their time together, or a ton of regret for their time, or nostalgia, nostalgia for their time together, simply saying, how he said, you have to be a plumber, so I was a plumber. He openly was excited for the replacement of Hunter with Adam Oates, and Oates seemed to actively engage Ovechkin more in the stakeholder role we're talking about. And the results obviously haven't been there so far this year, but it's been sort of an interesting contrast of accountability and deference to Ovechkin. Now, ultimately what I'm getting at is that Ovechkin's position as a coach killer was what he was labeled in several national and international publications at the time of Boudreau's firing. It's an unnecessarily pejorative starting point. Now, the financial stake is obviously less important to the players than the reputational stake. Their financial stake is going to happen either way. But it's reasonable for Ovechkin, in my view, to have expected a lot of minutes and to expect to play a particular style to maximize his talents. None of that is inconsistent with wanting what's best for the team. Yet that's how it's portrayed consistently in the media. The idea that a suboptimal usage of Ovechkin would lead to success for the Capitals is, quite frankly, foolhardy. And the fact that they still haven't quite figured out what to do with him is just the search for a better relationship between him and the team. But in summary, what I'm saying is that there's a not insubstantial body of evidence from the tax code, existing accounting standards, and common sense that players have a role most normal employees don't. When dealing with the small subset of players with large, long-term guaranteed contracts, it's totally reasonable to move past the traditional notion of operating and financing expenses and classify it according to their roles as stakeholders within the financial structure of the organization. Players amount to a vital source of off-balance sheet financing and what amounts to a huge portion of teams' leverage. It's unrepresented on our typical understanding of how teams operate. Players are thus incredibly important stakeholders within the corporate governance of any organization. The above is merely just trying to be a polite restatement of the least charitable view of Ovechkin's time, or at least his recent time in Washington. But his influence remains strong in Washington, and I believe it should with the Capitals. The franchise likely cannot succeed without maximizing his potential. And him daring to have views on how to extract his best performance does not make him sullen or petulant. The way he chooses to exercise that might, but the mere fact that he has that influence is legitimate, I should say. It's his valid exercise of his leverage as a stakeholder. The reality is that we're undermined by the existing framework of manager versus employee. It's really both manager versus employee and something analogous to manager versus creditor. Now, while this is an admittedly imperfect framework, it essentially reworks common sense into a more robust academic body of knowledge to apply. Now, the added sophistication of corporate governance, I hope, serves to level that playing field and hopefully allow for more efficient management of these organizations. Or just to put it a different way, just because a player happens to be a coach killer doesn't mean that he's wrong. Thanks.
All right, we have time for a few questions. Are there any questions? I'll bring you the mic if you do. Oh.
Do you think it makes any sense to sign any athlete for more than 10 years?
That's sort of beyond what I was talking about, but yes, I think it's absolutely silly. With the exception of you take like a Longoria type contract where you're capturing a guy at his upswing in 22 where he's clearly paid under, where you have leverage and you can exercise that, absolutely, that makes a ton of sense. But to sign a player at well above the established market for 13 years, it's when players typically peak around 25, I don't think it was a wise decision. Especially given how much injuries in hockey, just one.
Are there other industries that have future salary commitments on the balance sheet?
Typically they're not. On rare, not counting like stock options and things like that, which can get a little bit more complicated.
What about executive pay?
Executive pay can be. It would be something where, but in most cases it's at will employment, even at that level, and there might be a contractual agreement for a buyout. So it's relatively rare where you're going to have such a long-term fixed commitment where it's, like I said, it's very similar to a debt payment where it's every 2 weeks you get the payment or else. It's very rare where that set of circumstances exists.
How does having the ability to trade contracts kind of affect looking at the value? You look at what the Red Sox did last year. The Dodgers basically just assumed their assets. They didn't really give up anything for them. They were just assuming those liabilities. So how does that kind of change as a team signing a contract, how you think about it in terms of valuation?
Well, debt can be sold or, let's use the most analogous situation with a lease or, leasing an piece of equipment. You can sell the lease. You can sign the lease. The same thing would apply. Just because whatever you're having to lease doesn't give you the economic return that you thought it would, the piece of equipment, doesn't mean that you don't have to pay the bill.
Are there any other questions? Oh, we got another one.
Wouldn't there be a an asset of equivalent value on the balance sheet if you actually put the unrecorded liability on the balance sheet? I mean, if that's the way the
Yes,
accounting
you'd have to
standard
do
worked.
both. Although arguably on your tax purposes, you might have already capitalized it under the roster depreciation allowance we talked about earlier, the
Right.
build-back part. You could argue that you're actually taking away equity in that situation.
Right.
But I would approach it the way you did. In fact, there's actually a court case, Fishman versus Wirtz, where when the bulls were sold in 1984, that's how they treated it in terms of, they called it unearned deferred compensation, which was, I haven't seen anywhere else ever.
Do you think they'll ever move in that direction where you put both the asset and the liability on?
I don't think that accounting standards will ever, I mean, it's such a small, weird set of circumstances where this would apply, but it's more similar to the operating lease, putting that on debt. Several of us that were educated at Stern under Aswap the Motor Inn, that's one of his big pet peeves in corporate finance class, so it grows out of that. But it's more for valuation purposes than anything else, not for accounting or tax purposes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? All right, Steve Ardress, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.